Welcome back. The Eurozone still threatens to be torn to shreds. The US is heading towards a fiscal cliff. The world economy seems to be stuck in second gear as even China's growth is slowing down. Add to that a growing mistrust towards the financial markets, mass unemployment in several countries that used to have stable economies, and an environmental crisis with resource scarcity on the immediate horizon. Capitalism is the system that orders this world. Yet capitalism seems to be in trouble, and this trouble seems to be of its own making. But frankly, at least in the short term, we don't have a lot of viable alternatives. So I ask, how do we save capitalism? To answer this question, please welcome Pontus Braunerhjelm, Professor in Economics, KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. Krusel, Professor of Economics at Stockholm University, also the chairman of the Committee for the Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. Welcome. And Professor Henry Montgomery, Emeritus Professor at the Department of Psychology, Stockholm University. Warm welcome. They say, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. So let's start there. Is there something fundamentally wrong with what capitalism has developed into? Krusel.
Easy question. No, I guess your question has the word fundamentally wrong. So I have to say that simply, I don't think so. I don't think there's something fundamentally wrong. But having said that, of course, we are facing all these problems that you mentioned. And I think one issue in the debate on TV when you witness crisis after crisis is that they tend to be lumped together. And the fact that we're here talking about is there something wrong with capitalism, I think is a little bit of an oversimplification. I mean, and also as you indicated, probably the alternative isn't there, realistically. So the question is what to do exactly. And I think then you really have to think about each problem separately. The euro crisis is one problem. The budget crises in different countries, they are related, but they're in a way different, etc. The financial crisis. So I think the broader question maybe is how much government involvement do we want? That's the way it's often phrased in sort of in politics.
So what kind of capitalism do we want?
So first of all, you might say more or less government. That's like the classical political divider. And but I think there, at least when I grew up here in Sweden, you know, there was a term, still is a term called bland economy. I guess the translation
economy.
is not, it's mixed. It's not bland economy. It's mixed economy, which means large market and large government, and the two live happily together, supposedly.
You would say that being Swedish, of course.
I would say that being Swedish, and I think it's still true, but there's a little bit more emphasis on the market now than when I grew up. And I think we have come to an understanding of what works a little bit more, but obviously there are big problems. And so that I think that you have to think in these terms, but the more difficult question is, what exactly should the government do? And when we regulate, for example, financial markets, what exactly should we do to regulate them?
I think we're going to return to that question. I'll turn to you, Pontus. Between the historic capitalism that we learn about in school, monopoly men and company builders, and the sort of disaster capitalism that we read about in the papers today, there seems to have been some kind of shift from, and again, this is like completely the layman's understanding, but from investment based on the production of the company to speculation based on future values. Now, to the average citizen, this makes most of the economic system seems like a game of pretend, wishful thinking at best, gambling at worst. How wrong are we?
Pretty wrong, I would say. But of course, there are parts of that you can see in the way today's capitalism works, not least in the financial sector. But let me start with saying that you could read in the Financial Times, in one of the editorials just a few days ago, that if Karl Marx would have lived today, he would have been in the banking sector, because that is the sector where you exhaust all profits through high wages and generous bonus schemes, and you leave nothing for the owners. Which I think it's some sort of sign of that when Financial Times addresses it in that way, something is messy with capitalism. And to complicate it a little bit further, you know, I mean, as we seem to agree here, there is no viable alternative, at least not in the short or medium run. But how to mend it then? I mean, it's the problem that we have too much or too little of capitalism. And I could argue that we have too little in many ways. We don't have markets that work. We don't have costs that are fully carried by those who should carry it when it comes to, for instance, pollution, which is not internalized in prices and costs, etc. We have a lot of vested interest that seems to interfere with the marketing, with the way market works. So there one could argue, yeah, we actually need more of capitalism if we define capitalism as a market-based economy. Yeah. On the other hand, I mean, we have huge differences and increases in income distribution. They have quadrupled, perhaps tripled in the last 3 decades. There one could argue, there seems to be something wrong there, and the capitalism has not worked so well. But it boils down to some kind of policy failures, I would say. You could solve those with, a government to really take those issues and pursue the policies to make a turnaround of the situation.
I noticed that you're saying you want both more and less capitalism. More and less free markets at the same time.
Economists.
We're going to return to this. Very interesting. Henry Montgomery, the idea of the wisdom of the market is based on assumptions about human behavior, like humans always being rational, and of course also humans always having access to all relevant information. As a psychologist, to what degree do you agree with the economists' view of humanity?
First, I would like to say that I don't think that even the economists believe that each single person in the market is fully rational. And certainly they also know that they have limited access to information, and they make decisions which are not economically sound. But perhaps they believe that on a group level that the market works quite well, and especially in the long run. But then I would say, as a psychologist, that also this assumption, I think, is partly wrong. Because there are certain phenomena, psychological phenomena, which also work on the group level and actually work functions worse on the group level than on the individual level.
What are some of those?
There is the phenomenon which you could simply call groupthink. So the most dangerous thing that can happen in an economy always, it is when all parties involved in the economy think in the same direction, share the same view, when they should not do that. I mean, in an ideal society, there are different ideas balancing each other, different interests which are kind of balancing each other, and then the best interest, those who have the strongest arguments win in the long run. But when everyone believes the same thing, then it's really dangerous. And that is what happened in the financial crisis 2007 to 2008. Everyone believed almost everyone believed in the subprime mortgages and these CDO bonds and all these fancy financial investment products. The ordinary people believed in them because they could make easy money by borrowing on their house. The banks believed in them. The government in the United States also believed in them. The rating institutes believed in it. So, and these parties should balance each other. They didn't.
But to ask a sort of childish question, isn't the economy just a massive case of groupthink? When there's a depression, it's because everybody believes it's going badly, and when there's an up market, it's because everybody, on average, agrees that everything will be well.
Well, there is some rationality to it. If you behave like the rest of the group, I mean, your own risk exposure is less, I guess, because if everyone does the wrong thing, well, you're not alone if you're there, but if you happen to pick another path...
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, the typical argument against that is that if everyone does one thing, maybe going against everyone can actually make you a lot of money. So,
exactly.
so there are clearly forces in the other direction.
I agree.
There were these forces. There were a few persons who made lots of money.
So if
they understood what was going on.
If we take the idea of economic man, and you would like to add some properties, would you, Henry? What would you like to add to this model of
then
the
another
human?
thing which I really would like to emphasize is that first I would like to say before this is that people often think that the wrong thing with us is that we are too much driven by greed and fear, by emotions and strong motives, and but I don't think that is the main problem actually, because it's actually quite good to have what you could call gut feelings, which always they are quite sensible often actually. But what is wrong with us often is that we live too much in the present. So what is now? Actually, the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman has coined the expression, "What you see is all there is." What you see is all there is. So what you have now around you, what is close to you, temporally and spatially, is what really is. The other things are not that real. And you also think that the future will be about the same as today, perhaps a little bit better, a little bit worse. And you're not prepared for dramatic changes that often happen, actually. You're always so surprised, because you can't imagine that a very different reality will be as real in the future as the reality is today.
That's fun, because that connects back, of course, to what we were talking about before, that really nobody in companies currently it's nobody's job to keep their eye on the horizon, on the long run. I'd just like to return to the first question, because I think Perry argued very well that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with capitalism. I'm just going to throw this out there. Is there something fundamentally immoral with capitalism?
Can I just then, as a way of starting the discussion about that, I think there are actually two reasons why you might like to have government involvement in general. One is to fix markets when they don't work, or help people be more forward-looking, could be one reason. But another reason is what you touched on, which is that government is there partly so that the outcome that we get is more ethically okay. Redistribution. I think that really that's one of the government's role, and it's big in some countries, small in some countries. And we have different political views on it, and so in that sense, obviously there are ethical issues. Obviously, economics is about outcomes. If you use this system, you get one outcome. Use another system, you get another outcome, and that really drives what we think.
I'd just like to point out that it's a little fun that you use these around the word ethically.
I think that's what you meant, right?
Yeah, but it's also not just about redistribution, obviously, with, for instance, the environmental issues, challenges that we're facing.
Future generations. It's the same thing.
We have another speaker joining us on Skype, I hope. Please welcome Josh Lerner, professor at Harvard Business School, where he teaches, among other things, the wildly popular class Venture Capital and Private Equity. Thank you for joining Crosstalks. Hello, Josh Lerner.
Thank you.
Thank you, welcome. Professor Lerner, in your current book, Boulevard of Broken Dreams, you take a hard look at the massive economic interventions in the last few years, where public funds are being poured into failing companies. In effect, you write, this makes our governments venture capitalists, and you question whether they are very good at being venture capitalists. Would you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, it is a great question, and I hope that you can hear me okay from the video.
We do.
I think that it's fair to say that when you look at almost a world that's developed a hub of venture capital activity, and that would include not just simply places like Israel and Singapore, but also places like Silicon Valley in the United States, you see that there has been an important role for a government in terms of catalyzing the process. That this is not something that the private sector has done by itself.
Yes.
So in that sense, you can say that it's totally natural that governments such as Sweden's and others would look towards the model of trying to have government intervention to promote new economic activity. The problem, though, is that for every effort that's been a successful one, it seems that in many instances there have been unsuccessful ones where the government has spent lots of money to encourage new ventures and had nothing to show for it. And I think that's the major challenge, is making sure that not so much that the government tries, but the government effort is effective.
Now, how do we do that?
So I think that you can point to several things that are really the hallmarks of government programs that are successful. One principle is very much the idea of saying not to just simply rush and hand out money. In other words, not to go immediately towards providing funds, but rather to focus on making sure that the environment is a good one, a conducive one for entrepreneurial activity.
Sure.
And when we think about, what are the kind of things that matter, clearly there is a whole set of issues around taxes and regulations and so forth, that if these things aren't in place, even if government puts all the money in the world into these efforts, it's unlikely to have a lot of returns from it. The other thing is basically having a bit of a reality check for the government efforts by essentially insisting that the people who are raising funding, who are given funds, also go and raise some funds of their own to do this. In other words, to make sure there is the reality check of being able to go out and raise a private capital. So it's not just simply governments pursuing topics that might seem good in paper, but in practicality don't really work. So that's a couple of thoughts that I hope are helpful in terms of answering your question.
But when we pour public funds into failing companies, the governments become venture capitalists specialized in really bad business. Does that make sense? Can you hear us, Professor? Unfortunately, we seem to have lost the professor for a while there. I'll turn to the others. What do you feel about that? So, any reactions spontaneously?
I believe that, what Josh said here really was that if you don't have it right in the first place, when it comes to institutions that are conducive to entrepreneurship and businesses and those things, well, then you can't replace that with subsidies, governmentally subsidized venture capital and other financing. You have to have a double focus here. If the governmental money is going to work, you have to make sure that you also have a market that works.
But if you could just as well finance whatever the company is through the market, then there's no need for the government to step in at all.
But there could well be, of course, market failures for a number of reasons. So there may be a role for the government to play here, because you have information asymmetries and you have uncertainty and you have a long time sequence that you look ahead before something can be expected to be realized. So, there are arguments why you could have a governmental player here, but the devil is in the detail, and I think that's very clear in Josh's book, that there has been some success stories, and try to learn from those, but for every success story there are 9 that fails. So do your homework and see how were those systems designed that really did promote the outcomes.
But
that
you
we
said
wanted.
market failures, so why is it my responsibility as the taxpayer to keep the private sector afloat or a system that seems to be failing afloat?
That I would never argue that it would be the taxpayers.
Well, the government invests that's my money, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Now, you would be careful, I would say. Sorry, Per.
No, it depends. We use the term market failure for not for bad business. Bad business should go out of business. I think that's clear. You shouldn't, as a taxpayer, support it. But market failure can mean, for example, that when I drive my car, I don't take into account that I'm warming the globe, and the climate problem is an example of a market failure. I never pay for those costs, and then the government, I think, has a good argument to step in and do something. And then, in that case, maybe they should subsidize, for example, new technologies. But again, then Josh's points are relevant. You have to make sure that you do this in a smart way. And subsidizing, the argument you find in that the market doesn't work somehow, but then implementing it and doing it is a much harder issue. So
would you argue that over time, one limit that we should have on, for instance, government spending would be that it would have to be a fixable problem? There would have to be some kind of time frame, even if it's 100 years, where you can stop subsidizing?
Well, not necessarily. No, I don't think so. Because if
take education.
Yeah, I think there are cases where economists call it positive externalities or negative externalities. They simply mean that when I do something, I incur costs or benefits on other people without getting paid for them or without having to pay for them. And that happens all the time, and because they happen, they're not likely to go away. That means the government should probably step in and do something, try to correct things so that maybe there's a little bit more education and less pollution and so on.
So the whole society generates benefits from this, of course. I mean, that's the point.
I'd like to. I think I'm going to have to go back to the beginning and again say, well, because it gets so abstract so very fast. Is there something? There is something. We agree that there is something wrong with capitalism, that with the system that needs fixing in one way or the other. Now, the political right would seem to suggest more and purer capitalism. We also mentioned this before. More and purer capitalism as a blanket solution for capitalism's problem that would, for instance, prevent some market failures at least from happening. The political left suggests, and not broadly speaking, the political left suggests tougher regulation of the financial markets and of the industries as their blanket solution. I am asking to you, as scientists in this field, is there a scientific method to find out who is right, or are all the world's economists guessing based on political bias?
I guess it's a question that you should ask all of us, because I mean it's a big one.
Yeah, I'm asking all of you.
I mean, I think as a social scientist, I would say that economics and other social sciences are really good things to be involved in to try to answer this question. And I think you have to realize that we always have both normative, like ethical issues, and other issues like what I mainly do is to try to understand how the world works, why, as opposed to what should we do exactly. Because I think this what should we do exactly, you shouldn't rush to a conclusion just because there was some problem with house prices, we should go in and immediately we shouldn't allow people to borrow so much. No, wait a minute, let's think about exactly what's going wrong, why, and the starting point is always, how does the economy work? And that involves all these different sciences,
but there's not just the distinction between normative and descriptive. There's also a distinction between descriptive and predictive. And economy doesn't, I'm sorry, but to the layman, again, economists don't always, you seem to be pretty good at describing, but not always very good at predicting. So is there something, is it more of a descriptive science? Or?
I think it's a normative science. And there you have some sort of predictions building on a model that you have developed or others have developed. But predicting as such is something that is a bit different, I would say, from, it's part of it, but it's not the main thrust of economics to predict things, but to point at structures, at regulations, how they work, what the impact they would have on a market. That is much more to the core of economics, I would say. Then you have a whole industry that is involved in predictions, and they do it all the time, and you have all kind of fancy models. I guess we have a lot of psychological influences here, and they are very hard to capture in those models.
Henry Montgomery.
I think so. That's something I really would like to say. I think this question, the answer, the persons who are supposed to answer this question, they are 90 to 99% something. They are economists. So I think one should much more rely also on people from other social sciences. For example, with regard to prediction. If you take predictions based on economic models, there are also psychological factors involved, which are just disregarded, as I can understand, in these economic predictions. So just ask psychologists, how would people, for example, how would they, if you increase the tax, for example, you decrease the tax for those people who work, and those you don't do it for those who get pensions, and then the economists think, okay, you have made it better for one group, and the others have the same. But the psychologists would say, no, you haven't, because those who have not got better, they think that their situation is much worse, because relatively speaking, they have a less good, worse situation than they had before. Just one simple thing, which is in line with the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman's prospect theory, that people think in relative terms and not in absolute terms. And also, if you take prediction, there are many studies which show that people, it's much better to have a simple mechanical model, a simple regression equation, than asking experts to make predictions. But still, people think that if you ask an economic expert, he will do it better, or she. And there are so many other things with how people, for example, having to do with information asymmetry. So people, if you have an investment project of some kind, those who have constructed it, they have some idea of it, and those who buy it have another idea, and that could be. Which creates big problems in the long run for people who feel that they have been fooled and so on because they haven't understood what the whole thing was about.
So
there are so many places where, for example, psychologists could come in, but I guess this could also be true for historians or political scientists or so on and so forth. Too great dominance of economists.
But Henry, that's probably true in many ways. But I mean, it depends on what you're optimizing also.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's the individual's feeling of good, or if it is a societal welfare function where you may have these kind of differences, as you mentioned, with regard to those who are working and those who are pensioners, and you want to transcend people into more working activities. And then at the societal level, welfare increases, you have more means to redistribute, etc. So
it's a development within our field now.
Yeah.
I mean, you were on one of the grading committees for one of my students in economics, and we do cooperate. And
very good. Well, yes, that's true.
I mean, it's a development in economics clearly that to touch base and be more interactive with other social sciences.
It's much better now.
Professor Lerner, would you like to come in?
Well, I think that the whole issues that are being raised are incredibly important ones, and it's probably fair to say that as a profession, we've been perhaps a little slower to react than we should have been. So, for instance, in finance, it's fair to say that, while there's been, a lot of research looking at the specifics of the credit crisis and what happened, I think there's clearly some more fundamental questions that need to be asked. And I think in some ways you can say that we as academics are not as good at, sort of tearing up the playbook and saying, how do we rethink about things than perhaps we should be?
Well, that's a question for all of you. You've been teaching for long enough to be partly responsible for everything that's going on in the financial world right now. Have you been teaching it wrong?
Well, that's a question no one wants to.
No one wants to know, but I'm putting you to it.
No, I mean,
you've been teaching most of us, I think.
I mean, I actually, well, nowadays I clearly try to bring people into the broader subject, and you have to ask, you have to try to see if there's a way of tearing up the playbook and thinking of an alternative. And but I guess it's partly difficult just because we have our own histories, and the new generations of economists will have more ideas. But we do the best we can, I think.
Yeah.
And of course, I would like to be critical. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't. I'm not here for political reasons. I think this is like a super exciting area. And if someone tells me there's new idea that might overturn completely what you thought, well, too bad maybe, because of my publications they will be worth less. But at the same time, it's super exciting. So,
Josh Lerner, you teach venture capital and private equity. Does that class have an ethics section?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, sorry. You teach venture capital and private equity. Does that class have an ethics section? Should it have an ethics section?
Ethics, Josh.
Ethics.
Yeah. So I think it's a very interesting question, because clearly, in many respects, one can say that much of the presidential election that we just had in the United States revolved around questions around ethics and venture capital and private equity. Right? There was a sense that in many situations, companies had benefited in situations where the financiers had benefited in situations where the employees and the companies themselves hadn't benefited. And obviously, many of these cases were controversial ones, but the questions that were raised were certainly very important and fair ones. You know, we certainly try to grapple with these issues in our classes at Harvard. We, in fact, you know, sort of make, you know, a whole section of the MBA curriculum dealt with ethics and business standards.
Yeah.
But in some sense, it's a natural question to ask is, we're teaching students who are typically 26, 27 years old, and these are in some sense already fully formed people. And in some respects, you can't really, in some ways, really expect to change how people fundamentally are once they reach that age. In a way, you know, it's got to be something that's not just done at the business schools, but it's done much more generally in society to try to convey the importance of these messages.
Thank you. That makes a world of sense. That makes a world of sense, absolutely. And it looks, Henry, like as though you were nodding. I wonder, though, I mean, it's a bit of a cop-out to say the way to fix capitalism is that we just need a more generous culture in some way, or a more ethical culture. But is that actually the answer?
Yeah, I think a culture where you really take it seriously, that each human being has the same value. That's and I would say also more and more democracy. The more democracy you have in all senses, the better it is. Is
it possible?
And that's the foundation of democracy, is this idea that every person has the same value.
Is that also the foundation, the capitalist idea of humans? Does that also include everyone having the same value? Fundamentally, I'm honestly asking. I don't know.
I wouldn't say that's the case, really.
No,
It doesn't make that normative statement. That's more like a normative statement that we can all agree whether we like it or we don't like it. And I mean, I think that's a nice principle, so I don't want to disagree with it, but I don't think it's a fundamental assumption of capitalism.
No. Should it be, though? I mean, could it be?
That's where the government comes in, and where you may want to have the market, but you know, do a little bit of tinkering with it, and like tax a little bit and redistribute a little bit and make sure that everyone gets an okay education.
Well, Pontus suggested before that we should have more freer capitalism and also more regulation where it counts. So is that possible? Is that how we fix capitalism? Is it even possible to have both more and less at the same time?
I think it's definitely possible. I think transparency is one important thing here, and we haven't mentioned that. And that is obvious when we look at the financial market, that there was a huge lack of transparency. Then I believe, I mean, we live in a globalized economy today. Probably we need to rewrite the societal contract. We are used to a welfare state here in Sweden. Taxes are collected, redistributed for all kinds of means that we find valuable. But today, the tax base has become much more mobile, and you don't necessarily have that source anymore. So I think philanthropy, a little bit more of the Anglo-Saxon traditions and societal contracts, also has to be part of the traditional welfare states contract. We have to go in that direction, I would say.
At the same time, a lot of countries
that would legitimize capitalism also.
Do you guys agree?
I think I would just say that the development in Sweden is a good example of what Pontus was talking about. I mean, you have Sweden has been kind of a mixed kind of economy, and then the pendulum has gone back and forth, but every time it moves, it kind of improves some things, and perhaps other things become less worse. But in the long trend, I think it's everything becomes a little bit better actually. So I think I think we'll never reach the real equilibrium, but come closer to it, perhaps. And I think actually Sweden, I think I would like to say that, is a very good model for the whole world. But now we can see really that we have a very good economy here, and
we learned from some previous crises.
And also we have a government which is I would not reveal my own But still, they have taken over from the previous government some ideas, and they also actually are good at kind of changing now when it doesn't work, and so on. And the other
part, very broadly speaking, to the international audience, both are left and right.
They are.
Everybody is sort of in the center now.
Yeah, they are, and they pick ideas from each other. I think that's very good.
I wonder, the environmental crisis is a really great and urgent example of an issue where the short-term interest of individual investors is in glaring conflict with the middle to long-term interest of everybody. And I wonder whose responsibility that is, because we're looking at a situation, and this is not just me saying this and a lot of environmentalists, it's also the World Bank and the entire global energy sector is in agreement. We're looking at a situation where markets will physically disappear. And a lot of people will, well, I mean, we have a global trend where a lot of people are moving into the middle class, but quite a lot of people will be moving and dying out of the middle class as well. That's what we're looking at in our lifetime and in our children's lifetime. How is this not everybody's problem? How can this only be a government problem rather than also a problem for the private sector? I'm forcing your answer here, I'm sorry.
I mean, this is the tragedy of the commons to some extent. It is a market failure there, and we already touched upon that, and Per mentioned that. Costs are not internalized and not put on those who should carry the burden of those costs. And there are, of course, policy measures, but huge political problems. How to come to an agreement to solve this. And that needs to be done.
If we, the citizens, say, we thank capitalism for this insane amount of prosperity and peace, really, that it has provided us with. But right now, saying it's a market failure isn't good enough. This needs to be fixed. How would you guys respond? Like if you were the king,
we're learning,
king of the global market, and got to decide, what would you do?
I'm very involved in the climate problem right now because I've been doing research on it for several years, and I think that it's an excellent idea to just use taxes to tax the bad activity. I mean, that's exactly, but that's what's really hard to get political agreement on, like we just heard. And I also that relates to another thing that you didn't bring up. I mean, we see a lot of blaming on economists or people, or I don't know, but I think that in these crises there are really several crises, but one type of crisis that we've seen mostly in Europe, but even in the US as well, is political crisis, in the sense that markets and ordinary people, we have to wait to see what the politicians can maybe agree on, and they just keep kicking the can in front of them. They can't agree. And this was true in the US because they had to do budget cuts. They never did it. They're still kicking the can in front of them. In Europe, what are we going to do with Greece, etc.? I mean, this is a political crisis, I would say.
That ultimately comes back to the citizenry, because of course we give ultimately the mandate comes from us.
But
we're moving to audience questions. I'm looking to see if we have any audience questions prepared. Do we? There's a young man over there. Go right ahead. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much. I'm Boda from Stockholm University, and here I have a question. I have read an article before in the Time magazine which said now in the financial crisis in the 2008 is kind of due to the China's unpaid workers, and after that, many banking organizations have forced China to stronger the Chinese currency. And now it seems like China has Chinese workers have a better paid. But does it really solve the problem? I mean, with many small companies in China now is facing the bankruptcy. Does it really solve the problem of the capitalism, or is it just a strategy to slow down the China's development?
Thank you. That's a recap. So the unpaid workers of China were being blamed for the 2008 crash. Now there has been some corrections in some way to the Chinese currency. Will this solve the problems of capitalism, or is it just driving Chinese small businessmen out of business?
Do you want to start?
I mean,
go right ahead.
I think that the financial crisis started with a few different factors that happened at the same time. And one issue was the lack of transparency in the creation of these new mortgage-backed securities and all that. And that has nothing to do, that itself has nothing to do with China. And I think that's what triggered it. And I think there was a long-run trend of a lot of saving from China, and that's a way of saying that maybe they didn't consume it, maybe their workers didn't consume it. And Bernanke, the Fed leader, has been a strong proponent of that view that capital flows from China, not being consumed there by the workers, but rather invested in the US, has pushed down interest rates, and the low interest rates have been a part of a reason why the financial market started behaving more and more funny. So there is an argument there, I think, but I think it's really early to say whether that's really a main factor. Or I certainly think that without the mortgage-backed security crisis, I don't think we would have talked about this at all the same way.
So in that case, does it, on the other hand, the other part of the question, has it helped? Is the global economy now more real or corrected by these changes in China?
You mean by the changes in appreciation of the Chinese currency and the increased wages? I guess so. I think the argument is a little bit far-fetched, but there is some truth to what you said. But you could go even further back to try to explain the crisis with the saving glut in the mid-1990s. I think it's a natural movement when you have a huge current account surplus that your currency start to increase in value. It can take time, for sure, but it didn't happen. And when it happened very slowly in China. And that would in turn promote more of domestic consumptions and those things, more of imports, and that would tend to balance the global economy in a better way.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Boda. Thank you. Could we have another question from the audience, please? Yeah, sure. Can I just have a question from the back? Yeah, were you there? Thank you. Sorry, thanks. Yes.
Thank you. I'm a student from Stockholm U, and my question is, how do you think the paradox between the socialized production and private-owned materials for production, is that a substantial problem for capitalism? And if it is, how can we solve that problem? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood either.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sorry, the paradox between the socialized production and the individual-owned materials for production.
In China, for instance?
For the capitalism. Is that a substantial problem for the capitalism? I think
it would be... Okay, so we have to go back to this as a foundation. How much socialized production is there in capitalist countries at all? Not very much anymore, no. So it would have been within social democracies, I guess historically would have had those in a mixed economy, as what you were saying, that situation did arise and does arise. Do you see that as a fundamental paradox? Basically, we're looking at the fundamental paradox, I think, if I understand this question correctly, of the mixed economy in itself. So the state ownership, essentially, which you could call, I guess, socialized production.
I think it's not. I wouldn't use the term paradox. I mean, I think that there's an argument to be made why some things could be run better by the government, but I think maybe in Sweden we've assumed that a lot of things can be run better by the government, and then gotten used to it, and then when they've been privatized, some things have worked extremely well. We don't maybe talk much about them, but and other things, when they don't go well, they are all over the headlines, and so I think it's a little bit hard to predict. Actually, I think.
So can I read this answer to say that as we live in mixed economy, for people in mixed economy systems, it seems so unproblematic that it doesn't seem as a paradox at all.
I don't think so.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you. We have a Skype question. Hello. Hello? Do we have a Skype question?
Hello.
Who's there?
My name is Daniel. I'm from Örebro. Thanks
Hello, Daniel.
for a superb show, first of all. I have a question for you guys. I currently work for a venture capital fund currently supporting children with HDAD. And do you think there is a connection between Bill Gates' HDAD and his wealth?
Is this...
Is that... we know that? That's
we don't... Do we know about...
Bill Gates suffered from? Or?
Do we
If I
know
understood.
about Bill Gates' diagnosis? I'm not sure.
Yes, we do, yeah.
We do apparently. So I guess the question is, are certain kind of physical alignments of the brain, do they lead to better entrepreneurs? Is that your question?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
Yes?
That's
We're looking to the psychologist.
Precisely.
That's a very interesting question, Daniel. Thank you.
I don't think it's possible to answer the question simply.
No,
We don't have knowledge enough to answer this.
We don't have enough knowledge, I think, of the diagnosis or indeed of Bill Gates'.
What diagnosis has he?
HDAD, I think. Yeah.
Yes, but myself, I'm actually a little bit skeptical to many of these diagnoses. I think it's actually discussed among psychologists that there is a problem of over-diagnosis, an inflation in diagnostics. So that he has
Unclear. Maybe no connection.
Unclear.
I don't
So
think,
you're saying perhaps the other way around, because of this hyperactive success.
That some of the behaviors that are associated with ADHD could be good actually. But but I think when you have this. When you talk about this diagnosis, you also have an idea that something is wrong, and the wrong part, the sick part of it, has nothing to do, I think.
Yes. So we're also saying there might be also a diagnostic sort of error. That certain kind of behaviors produce the diagnosis rather than the other way around. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I'm not
Daniel.
sure either, but
Thank you anyway. I'm sure we'd like to add at this point that very neurotypical people can become very successful entrepreneurs as well. That's good. Do we have another Skype question? Perhaps, I don't know. We can take another question from the room in the meanwhile. There you go. Yes, thank you. Sorry, there.
Thank you, Evgeny KTH. I would like to raise the issue of multinational corporations. Besides they conserving the developed markets and threatening the developing markets, there is a lot of negative rumors around and about lobbying and financing different stuff. Do you think it's the issue is up to date? Is it still the issue, and is there a way to solve it? Maybe anti-monopolic committee, global.
Can you be more specific on what the rumors were? Or
for example, one of the French corporations there is a rumor was financing the Tunisia invasion, or all those buying out patents for lithium batteries and then holding it from oil companies, this kind of stuff.
Basically, we're looking at things like corporate war and massive lobbying and sort of super states.
From one side.
Well, evil corporations. I'm simplifying a lot here from the layman's perspective.
How to solve evil corporation issue?
Yeah, and do they exist?
Now, of course, they do exist. There will always be such cases, but I mean, there's a large literature showing very positive effects of the activities of multinational corporations. So it seems like a hard case just to view them as doing the bad stuff here. I'm certain that it happens, that it exists. You have a lot of strategic patenting procurements that you mentioned also. That's part of their daily sort of activities, more or less. But you know, on the whole, I would say that the positive effects of multinational corporations, particularly in developing economies, outweighs the negative effects.
Who do you think should regulate? And indeed, there are companies that are so large that they are very difficult to regulate by anyone at all, certainly individual states. Who should do this regulating that keeps them on the straight and narrow?
I think it's a little bit tricky to regulate someone else, especially if you do it from your own perspective of what you. I mean, we tend to think we should have the same work regulations regarding worker safety, for example, as we have here, etc. But it's not clear that that's what they really want. So if we should regulate, we should take into account exactly what they want. Of course, it's always better with more safety, more money, everything. But if they have a choice between more money and more work safety, I don't know, maybe they would make a different choice than we would. So I think it's important not to regulate
they being
against
people in other countries than
Yeah.
the one in which you currently are.
Right. I mean, I think it's very important to keep an eye on these kinds of horrible stories to make sure they don't happen. But regulation, I think, has to be dealt with, like at least in conjunction with these other countries.
Yes.
There are, of course, some international agreements dealing with this and sort of giving the floor for what is allowed and what is not considered allowed. Those will be broken anyways, but I mean, there are regulations around.
We've talked about, thank you very much. Then we've talked about how to save capitalism. We haven't exactly arrived at an answer. We've felt that adding more transparency is good, adding more regulation, and in some cases less regulation is good. I'd like to raise at this point the power imbalance as well between workers in different countries, and certainly, as you say, cultural differences play a big part in that as well. This conversation will have to continue. Luckily, the professors will be available to chat as we end this broadcast. Please give a big hand to Per Krusel, Pontus Braunerhjelm, Henry Montgomery, and George Lerner. Thank you very much. So, our professors will now move backstage and continue to chat with you on the crosstalks.tv website for another 10 to 20 minutes. That's plenty of time to solve the questions still open about the future of capitalism. And backstage, the next batch of speakers are getting ready. In a few minutes, at 7 p.m. Central European time, it is time for our final session of this evening. So the economy is in a tough place, but as we've already looked at, it's ultimately inseparable from another even greater challenge: finding a path to sustainable development and a resilient culture. We'll be back in a little while to figure out how to save the world. See you then. Thank you.